Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about A Christmas Carol. So, this is the overview video and the context video before you start reading and studying the play itself. So, let's start with Charles Dickens, the author. So, here are some basic facts about him. So, 1812 to 1870, born in Portsmouth, England, but he lived most of his life in London. Now, these dates, you don't need to remember his exact dates. And in fact, if you write them down in your essay, you won't get any marks for that, okay? You don't get any marks for kind of dates as such. You only get marks when you add information about context that adds value to the novel or whatever it is that you're studying. But one thing you should notice from here is that it's about 200 years ago, okay? And if you compare that with Shakespeare, it's about halfway to Shakespeare. So students often struggle with remembering dates, okay? So one of the ways I try to help them with that is by rounding off numbers. So with Shakespeare, if anybody ever asks you when Shakespeare was around, you should say roughly 400 years ago, roughly the year 1600, okay? So that's about 400 years ago. If somebody asks you about Charles Dickens, you can say he was born around about 1800. So that was about 200 years ago. So the main point there being that his language is not as difficult as Shakespeare's. Okay, it's easier, but it's not totally easy. If it was that easy, you probably wouldn't be studying it for GCSE. But anyway, language does change over time. All right. So 1812 to 1870, the book itself, Christmas Carol, is 1843. So just roughly remember about 200 years ago, which is about halfway to Shakespeare. He was an English writer and social critic. So, social critic means somebody who looks at society and critiques it, meaning to examine it in a constructive manner. Okay. Regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. So, some people might say that he was actually maybe the greatest fiction writer, second only perhaps to Shakespeare himself. And like Shakespeare, he also gave quite a lot of words and phrases to the English language. Not as much as Shakespeare, but quite a lot. He left school at the age of 12 to work in a boot blacking factory when his father was imprisoned for debt, and he worked there for about a year. I mean, his father wasn't totally bad. He did have a job, he did earn, but unfortunately, he couldn't control his spending, and so he did get himself into trouble and therefore was imprisoned for debt, and which meant that Charles Dickens had to go to work to support the family. He returned to school after 3 years. He wrote 15 novels, 5 novellas, hundreds of short stories, and non-fiction articles. Don't really need to know these facts as such. This is just background knowledge to help your study of the novella. And then in terms of context and what you need to add and how you do it, that obviously I will teach you as we go along. And he campaigned vigorously for children's rights, for education, and for other social reforms. And he was famous for his humor, satire, and keen observation of character and society. So, satire basically means the use of things like humor, exaggeration, irony. Irony is a difficult word. I won't go into that right now. So, satire is the use of humor and exaggeration to critique society. Okay. His 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol, remains especially popular, obviously, because we're studying it right now. Other famous novels include Oliver Twist and Great Expectations. So I mentioned that Dickens gave quite a lot of words to the English language, and here's two coming up. So the term Dickensian is used to describe something that is reminiscent of Dickens and his writings, such as poor social or working conditions or comically repulsive characters. So reminiscent means something that reminds you of. And A Christmas Carol is definitely about these things here. And Scrooge is definitely a repulsive character. So repulsive means horrible, somebody who you don't want to go anywhere near. But he becomes nice at the end and gave many other terms to the English language. For example, Scrooge, from the character of Scrooge in A Christmas Carol to mean stingy. So stingy is the opposite of generous. So Dickens was writing in the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, 63 years, named after Queen Victoria. So she was actually the longest reigning until our own Queen Elizabeth I, who sadly died recently. She reigned for 70 years, so she beat 63 years by 7. And before that, Queen Elizabeth I reigned for about 44 years. So that was in the time of Shakespeare. And our current queen was Queen Elizabeth II. Sorry if I made a mistake there earlier. So Queen Elizabeth II, our own queen. And it was a period of industrial, political, scientific, and military change within the United Kingdom and was marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. We don't need to worry too much about that. Victoria became a national icon who was identified with strict standards of personal morality. So the Victorian era, as you may know, was known for its repression about things like sex and so on. I mean, that theme is not particularly relevant to A Christmas Carol, and it wasn't particularly a theme that Dickens was interested in. Other schools study Jekyll and Hyde, and in that, repression, where you repress your desires and so on, that is a main theme in the Jekyll and Hyde, but we are studying A Christmas Carol. And but Victoria is relevant to A Christmas Carol because one of the main themes of Christmas Carol is the importance of family. So here you can see, so Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840 and had 9 children. They were actually first cousins, which was quite common in those days. We don't tend to do it nowadays, although in some cultures, some countries, they still do. And technically, it's not illegal. They were very much in love. So Queen Victoria and her husband were presented as this ideal family in Victorian times. And that's an important theme in the novella. So Dickens coincided with the later part of the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1750 to 1850. So with most of these things, you can't really give exact dates, okay? So again, I try to help students by rounding things off to the nearest decade or the nearest century even, depending on the situation. In Shakespeare's case, 1600 is a very nice, easy number, and it's very, very appropriate. But these are the rough dates of the Industrial Revolution. And 1843, when the book was written, obviously you can see there is towards the end of that. I mean, the effects of the Industrial Revolution carried on much, much longer after that. And some experts even say that we're still feeling the effects of it, but this is not history, so we don't need to go too much into that. And the Industrial Revolution created great wealth for some people, but also great poverty for others. Actually, it created a lot of poverty for most people, really, and only a few people at the top, as always, became very, very rich. And it also led to the rise of child labor. And as we've learnt already, Charles Dickens was a child laborer himself for about a year. Nowadays, we tend to think of child labor as only happening in other countries. But strangely enough, it started in Britain. It literally started in Britain and it kind of spread out from here to the rest of the world. The 1834 Poor Law. So this provided food, clothing, and shelter in workhouses in return for working a few hours a day. This sounds reasonable, but most poor people hated the workhouses, calling them prisons for the poor. The conditions in the workhouses were deliberately bad to encourage people to work and hence avoid them. And until this time, poor people had been given some little money for basic needs. So, like I said, this sounds reasonable, but actually, what actually happened was that before this, people would be given some money, and the rich people thought that poor people were avoiding work out of laziness. So they came up with this idea. and part of that was based on Thomas Malthus. There you've got the dates there. He was an economist, and strangely enough, he died the same year that this law came into effect. Just a pure coincidence. But one phrase that he used, which is actually mentioned in the novella, is surplus population. But we'll talk more about that when we study the book itself. So remember, so this is all about context. So remember, context is worth 15%, which is a lot. It's 1.5 grades. But the good news is it doesn't mean that your essay has to be 15% context in order to get those marks. No, just a few well-chosen points, just a few sentences here and there, either included in your paragraphs or maybe in your introduction or maybe in your conclusion. It depends. I can't give you an exact rule. It depends on the question and so on. And it depends on you and what kind of grade you're going for. But the main point being, you just need a little bit of context, well chosen, to get most of those 15% marks. Okay, let's move on to the summary of the novella. So novella means a short novel, a half a novel. And here's a summary in pictures. So in the beginning, we're going to see Marley's ghost. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the first spirit, the second spirit, the third spirit, and then Scrooge transformed at the end. We'll come back to these pictures at the end after the summary. So the book is set in London, 1843. The main character is Ebenezer Scrooge, a very solitary and stingy man. So stave 1, Marley's Ghost. So in this book, the chapters are called staves. So staves, and I'll mention this later as well, but I'll talk about it now as well. Staves are those lines on music paper. Even if you're not into music, hopefully you've seen music paper, and there's 5 lines, and the musical symbols are written on those lines. And this book has 5 chapters, okay? So that's why they're called staves. And also the book is called A Christmas Carol. So a carol is like a song. So that whole connection with song and music paper, that's why they're called staves. So stave 1 is Marley's Ghost. So the story begins with the death of Jacob Marley, Scrooge's ex-business partner. So it doesn't actually begin with his death. I mean, actually, when the story opens, Jacob Marley has been dead 7 years. But the book starts by telling us about that, and that's really, really important. And you'll see why when we study the book itself. We then learn that Scrooge has cut himself off from all society, including the only family that he has, his nephew Fred. We witness that Scrooge is a terrible boss to his employee, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge sees Marley's ghost, who warns him to change his ways and not to be so hung up on money. So Marley was very similar to Scrooge, and after his death, he finds out that it was not a good way to be. So he comes back to warn Scrooge, and that's part of his repentance, part of his making up for what he's done. Marley tells Scrooge that 3 spirits will visit him and guide him in how to change his life. Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits. Scrooge, so just going back here, so there you can see Marley, he's weighed down by these chains and money boxes that he made for himself in his life by being obsessed with money and business. Scrooge sees the first spirit, who looks like a child and an old man at the same time, and has a bright light shining from its head. So there you can see there. Okay, and he has this, what they call an extinguisher on to put on the light. That's a bit confusing, the whole extinguisher idea, but you don't need to worry too much about that. It takes him back to his childhood. We see him at school, lonely and neglected, and we meet his little sister, Fran, the mother of Fred, his nephew. Then we meet his old boss, Fezziwig, who is a jolly man and a good boss, the complete opposite of Scrooge. So remember, Dickens is writing about working conditions and so on, and there were no workers' rights in those days. And but despite that, Dickens is saying that with this character, employers can be good, can be nice people, and should be like that. Next, we meet Belle, his ex-fiancée, who cut off their engagement when he became obsessed with money. Now, you might think, or you might have been told that back in the day, people used to marry for money and business and so on. So she could have easily settle for the money, but notice that she doesn't. She leaves him. The second of the three spirits. Scrooge then sees the second spirit, who looks like a jolly giant. So this is day three, wearing a green robe and carrying a torch shaped like a horn. The torch gives light and also water. So there he is. So the green robe and lined with fur, and you can't really see the horn there. These two things here, you'll see what those are in a minute. The torch gives light and also water, so like holy water that it sprinkles on people. It shows in people celebrating Christmas despite being very poor and lonely. In particular, it shows him Bob Cratchit's house, Scrooge's employee, where the family are very happy together despite being very poor. They have many children, including Tiny Tim, who is disabled and not expected to survive. So here you can see the importance of family, just like Queen Victoria said, and her husband. You might think, why did they have so many children in those days? Well, most people did, and it was partly to do with religion, partly to do with lack of contraception and so on, lack of education. Another long scene is Fred's house, Scrooge's nephew, where Fred's family and friends are having a great party. Finally, we see that hidden under the ghost's robe are two children, but these are symbolic, not real. They are called ignorance and want. So, ignorance meaning lack of education, want means when you want something but you can't have it, so that's poverty. They look like monsters, and the ghost says that they have been created by society, which is controlled by the rich and powerful. So, symbolism is when the writer uses a physical object to represent an abstract idea. So abstract means non-physical, and it's usually ideas or emotions. In this case, these two things here. So if we just go back, so there they are. Want and ignorance is the other way around there. So we'll learn more about that as we study the novel or novella. The second spirit disappears suddenly, and the third spirit appears, which looks very dark and scary. Stay for the last of the spirits. The third spirit shows Scrooge his future, as it will be if he does not mend his ways. We learn that Scrooge has died alone and unloved. No one is sad about this, and in fact, some people have even stolen from his dead body. We revisit Bob Cratchit's house to learn that Tiny Tim, his disabled son, has died. So he could have been saved, but there was no national health service. You had to pay. They don't have the money, and he dies because of that. But actually, he is saved because Scrooge saves him, pays for his medical bills and so on. We find that Scrooge has been buried in a neglected graveyard, and Scrooge resolves to mend his ways. So, by the way, the third spirit, dark and scary. There we have it there. You can't actually see it. It's covered in this black shroud. Shroud is something that you wrap a dead body in. The end of it. And Stay 5 is a short chapter. He's completely transformed, Scrooge, into a happy, jolly, and generous person. He sends a huge turkey to the Cratchit's house. He walks around the streets and really enjoys it, watching the people and greeting them. And often just simple things like that, walking around, talking to people, can be the best thing. The best things in life are free, as they say. He gives money to charity. Then he goes to his nephew's house in time for Christmas dinner. He raises Bob Cratchit's salary and helps Tiny Tim, who survives because of this. And Scrooge resolves to live like this forever after. You can see here, he's been totally transformed. And that's Tiny Tim there. He becomes like a second father to him. Okay, so we've met the characters, but there's a summary. So Ebenezer Scrooge, we don't often hear his first name and you don't really need to know it, but Scrooge is the main name. The protagonist, which means the main character. So, I mean, I say you don't need to worry about this name, but Ebenezer is a biblical name and it has references to stones. And in the novel, he is described as hard and sharp as flint. Okay. And obviously, the connection with the Bible, there is some foreshadowing here that he's going to change. But there's also similes and metaphors in the first chapter, which also foreshadow Scrooge's change. Okay. And then we have Jacob Marley, Scrooge's old business partner, Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's employee, Tiny Tim, Cratchit's disabled son, who gets saved by Scrooge, Fred, Scrooge's nephew, Fan, Scrooge's sister, Fezziwig, Scrooge's old boss, Belle, Scrooge's ex-fiancée. I mean, these three we only really meet once, okay? But they are very, very important in portraying, painting a picture of Scrooge and how he became the way he is at the beginning, but then how he changes over time. So there's the three ghosts or spirits, past, present, and yet to come. So sometimes people say, oh, ghost of Christmas future, but technically it's that. And also a trick question sometimes is how many ghosts are there in this novella? And often people say three, but actually there's four if you include Jacob Marley's ghost. But that's why these are sometimes referred to as spirits. But either word is fine, spirit or ghost. And in this sense, they're called ghosts. So there are some pictures. You can pause the video and look at those yourselves if you want to. But I'm going to move on. So these are the main themes. Redemption means to be saved or to save someone from sin or error. And there's a quote from the book to show how he's changed. You can read that, pause the video and read that yourselves, but we'll come to that in the actual book itself. And then poverty, so there's people kind of asking for food, begging for food. The importance of family and the importance of Christmas. So sometimes, sorry, just going back to this, people say Dickens invented Christmas. He didn't actually invent Christmas as such, but before that, people didn't really celebrate Christmas in the way we do now. If anything, they used to celebrate Twelfth Night more. So Twelfth Night literally means the 12th night after Christmas Day or Christmas night. And there's even a play called Twelfth Night by Shakespeare to illustrate the point. But what Dickens did, but lots of people thought that Christmas should be reinvigorated, and Dickens certainly played a big part in that. And the way we celebrate Christmas now is a lot to do with Dickens and other people at that time and the 19th century, which is when Dickens was writing. Okay, let's move on now. So I'm just going to look at the first two pages of this book because there's a few things that I need to explain. So that, and also so that when we start the first video of the book itself, we can save a bit of time. I've mentioned one of them already, actually. So anyway, Christmas Carol, 1843. So this is really important. And then here are the chapter titles. So Marley's Ghost, and then first, second, and the last of the spirits. So notice there's actually four ghosts, but these are called spirits. They're also called ghosts. And I've explained that staves are those musical lines or those lines on musical paper, and the connection with carol or singing. The idea is that so that whole connection, that's why they're called staves. Also, because it's a novella and a ghost story, and it's short, the idea is you can read this one night, ideally on Christmas Eve, for example, but any time really. And then that kind of connects to the preface. So you don't really need to know this bit here, but I think it's useful like, as background knowledge, and especially for if you're aiming for higher grades. This introduces a style of Dickens that we see in his books as well, which is humor. So I have endeavored, which means try hard, in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea. So he's using puns, yeah, puns and humor, which shall not put my readers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, so Christmas season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly. So hauntings are usually unpleasant and people and scary, and people don't want them. In this case, He's hoping that people will want to be haunted by this book, and no one wished to lay it. So lay means to get rid of a ghost, but in this case, hopefully they don't want to get rid of this book. And they certainly didn't. It was an instant bestseller, and it has been ever since. Their faithful friend and servant, Charles Dickens, December 1843. So he actually wrote this book in 6 weeks. Okay, so there are some questions. So please pause the video here and answer these questions. If you struggle, you really need to go back and listen again. If you get most of them, that's fine. You can maybe then carry on with the book and the course and then come back. So when we study something, you do have to go through it 2 or 3 times, okay? That's normal. Some people think that, oh, if I don't get something straight away, there's something wrong with me, I'm stupid or whatever. No. Everybody has to go through things 2 or 3 times. I mean, yes, some people can do it quicker than others, but generally speaking, you do have to go through something 2 or 3 times. And in terms of context and the book itself, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, actually. It's hard to understand context without reading the book, but it's hard to understand the book without knowing a bit of context. So some teachers start with context, others start with book. There's no right answer. Both have got pros and cons to them. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So please pause the video here, answer these questions, and then check your answers. So 3, 2, 1, and moving to the answer slide now. So there's the answers. Please pause the video here, check your answers. Like I say, if you really struggled, please watch the video again. If you got most of these right, by all means carry on to the main course and then come back and do this again. Okay, and as always, if you found this video useful, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video, which will be the first video of the actual novella itself. So see you then.